And then finally, we have state policies that also come into play. You have, between California and the other zero-emission vehicle states, that's about 40% of at least Toyota's volume goes to those states. So that's a huge influence on what vehicles we design for the U.S. is based on what those states are asking and requiring. So local regulations can also be a challenge. So in this case, in New York and Boston, there are specific tunnel regulations that prevent the vehicles carrying compressed flammable gases from going through their tunnels. They were able to get waivers for CNG vehicles back 20 years ago. Well, then 9/11 and terrorism and a lot of other things hit, and they are looking much more carefully at new fuels and new technologies, and that has taken a lot longer than we would have expected to get cleared up. So there's also local regulations such as fire codes, building codes, that come into play when you're building infrastructure as well. So the final leg is consumer pull. And this is the current fuel economy standard for light trucks is the lower line, the upper line is passenger vehicles. This is what's being considered now, the NPRM. So this may change. I'm not going to suggest or imply which way it may change, but what I do want to show is here's over that same time period from about January of 2010, what consumers have been doing. They're shifting from basically an equal mix of car and truck buyers to predominantly truck buyers. And that's happened over the last 5 years. And what does that really mean? Well, when you look at sales-weighted fuel economy, we're not making any progress. So the actual vehicles that are being purchased by consumers today are not improving the fuel economy. And that is that shift from the higher efficiency passenger cars down to lower efficiency trucks. But ultimately, we're still struggling with how to get consumers to value fuel economy. Consumer pull and electrified vehicles, somewhat the same story. The graphic on the left is one of the scenarios that California put together to achieve their 2050 goal. In their view, what they'd like to see is by 2050, 87% of the vehicles on the road in California are zero-emission vehicles, either battery electric or fuel cell vehicles. But the point here is that if you look at the graphic on the right, you have the red line, which is hybrids, which have been in the marketplace for now 20 years, and basically roughly 4%, I think, on the high, dropping down to what is it now, 2.5%, probably 2% this year. So we really haven't seen much of a growth in hybrids over the last few years, and that's a technology that doesn't take any different consumer behavior. They just fill it up and go. Plug-in vehicles, the green line below, are making progress. They keep growing. But again, is that just hybrid buyers that are moving to plug-in vehicles? Unsure, but clearly the growth is not rapid enough to achieve the targets that some of the states have in place. So just to conclude, I think as mentioned earlier, the technology exists to meet those consumer needs as well as societal CO2 reduction goals. And really the consumer needs are key because it's a very important purchase, very expensive, but very emotional. There's an image component to it as well as utility. So to ignore those or to say we'll make a regulation that everybody has to buy a certain technology, I think there'd be a lot of pushback from the consumers. Toyota views fuel cells and hydrogen fuels an integral part to the solution. There's no silver bullet. It's going to take everything to achieve this objective of meeting customer needs, and fuel cells have to be part of that. Stable public sector support, both on the regulatory side as well as on the incentive side. If you're banking on a certain incentive to be in place, you hope that that's the case. As we've seen in California and other states, maintaining their state-level incentives have become very difficult, particularly as the volumes of vehicles increase. This goes back to just, we need volumes, we need variety of vehicles, and time. We can't change these vehicles over quickly. It takes 5 or 6 years for a new model, so whether it be fuel cell or your Chevy Volt, it has to be in the marketplace 5 years before the next generation. So it's very easy to see decades that it's going to take to achieve some of these higher volume targets. And then finally, it comes back to what Margaret and mentioned earlier is really the consumer demand is what's important here, and we need rapid growth in that near term to ultimately get us to where we need to be for success. So thank you for your attention, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much to all of our presenters. As promised, those were highly informative and articulate presentations. So thank you. We'll open the floor up now to Q&A, but I will take the liberty of asking the first question, and then from there, please just step up to the microphone to ask questions. So throughout, one common theme that came up in all of the presentations was the degree of technological uncertainty that exists, and then in Bob's presentation, he introduced the idea of regulatory uncertainty. So it's possible that you cannot answer my question, but I'll ask it anyway. What are the implications of the current position within the United States if we do freeze fuel economy standards? But then also coming back to the point that Sharyn made, that the rest of the world, or at least several other countries, are moving on without the United States. So what are the implications there for OEMs and the strategy within the energy, the transportation industry at large?
Okay, I guess I'll start on that one. Honestly, I think as I mentioned, because we have such a long view, as at least Toyota's view is quite long, that if you froze the standards today, is that a guarantee they'll be frozen in 5 years with the next administration? And I don't think we would be so rash as to believe that's the case. We see this global movement. We have our own internal targets to reduce CO2 and have more efficient products. And just because there's a change in one region's regulation won't change our view that that's necessary for society and the good of the goal or the importance of the human race. So we're going to continue on regardless of what the standards are. But I will say that there needs to be interaction between the regulators and the auto industry to make sure they are accounting for all the variables that we face as an industry trying to sell these vehicles and trying to make these vehicles.
Questions from the audience?
I have a question for So I'd like to expand a bit more on Toyota's bullishness on fuel cells. A lot of the advantages that you mentioned are also true for plug-in hybrids, which are now they're cheaper than fuel cells. And I don't want to make a long list of all the advantages and disadvantages. And what is the expectation, for example, that the fuel cell will ultimately be cheaper than the electric vehicle, other technology, or something else? Can you expand on that, please?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think that the plug-in hybrid is a very attractive option, and we see that in conjunction with the fuel cell as being a very good combination. I think one of the keys is the need for zero-emission vehicles. So if that is a regulation and a requirement, then you have two choices, or battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell. So that is one point. The other point is from the fuel cell standpoint, we do feel that when you're looking at cost curves longer term, that the price of a fuel cell system is going to be lower than an extremely low emission plug-in hybrid out decades from now. And again, we're trying to project what the regulations are going to be and what the world is going to be like as we live in, but we just see so much of a drive towards zero emission vehicles that the fuel cell is what we believe is an important option. Not the only one. We definitely don't think the public vehicles are necessarily small.
Maybe Paulina, and then
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question. What's the source of the hydrogen?
Well, right now, it's natural gas, which is roughly the same CO2 per mile as electricity generated from natural gas. We have suppliers that are looking at using renewable electricity, electrolysis, or nuclear or hydropower to make hydrogen. So just like electricity, you can provide fuels, both carbon
excellent bridge question to my question. So I come from the University of Texas, Austin. I've been looking at the shale gas and oil development across the country. And so my question is, to actually pretty much all the speakers, is to what degree do you take into account the fact that consumers change their behavior a lot more based on what they see going on in the energy industry in terms of more resource available here, so I think that the prices probably will not change much, or what will happen with electricity. And I'll give you background of that. So I'm about to buy a new car, and I just calculated that over the 10-year period, I essentially spent as much on the gasoline as much as I spent on the car. Okay? But being in Texas, I also looked at we have so much energy, so I don't see much increase in either gasoline or electricity prices. If I were in different region in the US, or if I were in China, so those perspectives would be different. So I wondered to what degree either producer strategy or consumer strategy are informed or influenced by what's going on the energy resource landscape, apart from other things.
Well, I might try to start with that. But I suspect everybody else will want to talk too. So the obvious elephant in the room is gas prices. And I didn't even go into that. We definitely see consumers reacting to higher gasoline prices. We're a bunch of economists. We should talk about internalizing the externality, and gas taxes and things like that would be a policy lever that would, of course, affect consumer demand, but then, we also have to deal, and we see it in history and data and stuff. So the other thing with that, of course, is the political economy of it. And then the other thing to mention about this is actually something that policymakers at the local, state, et cetera levels are dealing with is, as we get more electrification, how do we maintain the roads? And so what happens, how do we maintain the revenues that would actually support that? So all of this is another whole can of worms, and it's not even that much about the energy resources, and I was seeing that in the energy system. But you do see the gas prices for sure. You want to add to that? For the modeling costs people.
I would say you're probably you're in the minority that you've done the economics. I think that's probably, maybe 10% of the people out there might, or less, maybe consider the economics of their purchase. I think our analysis over the years has shown that when there's a big swing in gasoline prices, you get a lot of interest and people tend to move. But a slow increase, as we've seen over the last few years in gasoline prices, has not taken, really hasn't had an effect on vehicle sales, and we've seen the shift to slightly less fuel efficient trucks. But I'd like to say our industry is a little bit of a victim of its own success. We've managed to get the fuel economy of every vehicle up from what it was a decade ago. And if people like the type of precise vehicle they're driving, they see that as a benefit. And that might be enough to keep them in that vehicle. So whether you pick a truck or sedan versus moving to something that's different, that honestly they don't necessarily see the need because they haven't done the economics.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm with George Mason University. This question's for Sharyn. As you look at mobility as a service in the future, how much impact do you foresee on vehicle miles traveled?
Well, I'm just going to point to the DOE study that Margaret pointed to from before. That's where the huge range of uncertainty is, and that's where we don't have good information because we don't know, the past doesn't tell us all that much about it. Obviously, if the cost of driving goes down a lot, people tend to drive more, but it will depend on that sort of mix of how consumers respond and how the services are priced, and we just don't know that yet. So hopefully we'll narrow that uncertainty, the 300% change difference, but those are the big questions that are still outstanding.
Hi, Matt White from Exeter Associates. I was hoping you guys as a panel might comment a little bit about charging or refueling infrastructure and sort of thoughts on public versus private rollout of this infrastructure? What role do utilities have in that infrastructure? Any comments?
Well, I can just start with I'm sure everybody, all three of us have something to say about this, but one of my guest lectured at a couple of things at Stanford on strategic conditions of the EV industry, and they had a senior executive from ChargePoint come in and talk to all the MBAs talking about the many business models that ChargePoint has to have in different parts of the country. So some places it can be a utility, some places it is precluded from being a utility, some places it must partner with. I mean, it's really complicated. You know, the way they can, the business models are just really, really different in lots of different places. So most people, though, they will tend to charge at home. That's the major fact that we see. Then the next most popular is workplace charging. And the fun consumer side of that a lot of times is like liking to stick it to the man. So they love to charge at work, you know. Well, you know, when it's free, and then there's actually, and in the workplace charging world, there's a lot of really interesting different approaches to how to deal with congestion at chargers. So, you know, do you want to have a queuing, like Netflix, I believe, has a valet that will actually move your cars for you. HP, like they just get the signal you're done, and so like, you know, you better run. And also the end of the free is something interesting. One interesting thing I learned from the ChargePoint presentation is that when they work with Target, they have free charging for the first 2 hours because Target has figured out that for every minute you spend at Target, you're going to spend $1. But after 2 hours, you're going to probably just use the parking space to go to somewhere else in the mall. So that's when they put the charge on the package. So it's super complex and interesting. I do have some discussion of that in that report if you want to like kind of look into more of this. The pure public is really interesting too because you know, there's a fascinating rollout in Idaho to look at, a lot of really interesting data that came around the time of CHARP funding. And then I would also point you to, of course, anything about Tesla, which isn't really a pure public, but it is a public charging network for Tesla, and I think related at this point users. Yeah, other people? I'm sorry.
I mean, I guess one point that I would make is that when we talk about charging, we're, again, assuming that consumers are going to want to charge an electric vehicle exactly the same way that they refuel an electric or an internal combustion engine, and that might not be the case. I can't who attribute this to, but some people say, you know, the electric vehicles of the future might be more like giant cell phones, where people just want to top off a little bit everywhere they go, and they just don't want the battery to get too low. So it could be very different, and those again are questions that we just don't have answers to, but it could be a different way of charging that might be important.
Yeah, just to follow up on that is some really interesting things about having you actually get charging from the pavement or the discs in the parking lot, so you don't actually have to hold a charger. And there was one interesting thing was in some of the EV Everywhere advertising that was trying to reach out to women consumers. I was a little annoyed because they had this picture of this woman holding a baby on a grocery bag and a charger, and they're advertising it to women. I'm like, it just makes it so we have to juggle one more thing. So I think there would be an appeal to like actually not having to hold the chargers and stuff. I think there's a wealth of interesting things to study on the charging infrastructure. Did you want to add?
No.
Okay.
My name is Doug Danley. I work a lot with the rural co-ops across the United States. And I was wondering if you could just comment a little, you know, one graph stuck out at me about like charging locations or something. And it was all either Northeast United States or California and Washington and Oregon. Can you talk about, I mean, acceptance in the rest of the United States, you know, outside of the urban areas? How is electric vehicle acceptance being perceived across the country?
I can make a general comment that if you look at California and then the Northeast states, which are New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Maryland, New Jersey, Northeast, their electrified vehicles, whether it be hybrid or plug-in vehicles, the percent of those vehicles purchased every year is about half of what it is in California. So they're selling twice as many on a percentage basis of those electric drive vehicles in California than they are in the rest of the Northeast. And I believe that's the same in most of the rest of the country. Is it, the sales is half or below on a percentage basis of what it is in California.
And I'd add to that there's really a varying state level incentives too. And there's pretty significant rebate programs in at least 4 states. And the data is pretty interesting on some of those as well. The graphs that I put up with the head density and the maps and the plug-in density, those were slightly older than the ones that Sharyn has. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
No, I mean, the graph that I pulled up was from Department of Energy, and it's like 17,000 level 2 or higher charging stations today. And it's from the map, they're distributed throughout the country. So they're there. One example I like to talk about a little bit is Kansas City, that Electric. I mean, they made a concerted effort to invest in infrastructure and charging infrastructure there, and I think they have some of the highest, increases in electric vehicle uptake. So when I was making before, not everyone's like California, but there are other places in the country where they have shown that you can get adoption, and so I think it's a lesson to be learned.
And actually, speaking of adoption, getting beyond electrification, we were supposed to be hitting it, sharing autonomous too, is it's interesting to note where all of these mobility as a service new businesses get introduced. And it's definitely not just in California, although I do think it helps to be a college town.
Hi, my name is Carley from the American Energy Initiative. I had a question regarding some of the panel's comments on, I guess, average distances covered in typical trips in the US are not less than 30 miles, as Margaret mentioned, and a couple that will be sharing great concept around having in the range for PLENARY, say, the 300 miles and the vision for the typical refueling range for hydrogen vehicles.
No, fair question. I think there's so much uncertainty where mobility as a service autonomous vehicles is going to go, what's going to end up being the consumer perspective, the regulatory, where will these markets grow first, that until we have a better sense of that. I mean, most of the industry is sort of dipping our toe in the water with different, we have an agreement with Uber, GM has, Nathan, I think it is, and there's a variety of different demonstration programs going on. But I know internally the discussions we're having, it's still early stages, and there's so much uncertainty that I think we're just, like the rest of us, I think we're all trying to learn more about it and get a sense of what direction they take. So we're waiting to see how things turn out in the next few years. We're making big product decisions.
We can take both of the other two questions if they're short.
All right, David Gibbons of Argus Media. One panelist, pick any of these 3 random variables and how it's going to affect it in the future. E15, shale gale, and finally another economic shock like the coincidental decline in the number of dealerships concurrent with the Obama-era stimulus.
Well, E15, that's the easy one. Really no effect at all. We've not seen any issues with E15, regardless of how old the vehicle is. So that's not been an issue.
Do either of you want to take a stab? I wasn't sure I understood the part about the dealerships and the Obama stimulus. Maybe we could talk after. Thanks.
Okay, so last question.
Sesha, California Davis. I have an open-ended question. Do you feel, or is it your work in progress between OEMs and regulators just to sort of standardize the metrics that people can easily identify to quantify the real-world usage of, let's say, off-grid fuel vehicles, because that can ties into the consumer myopia when we talk about how they value, they perceive the fuel economy savings over lifetime, and what is the difference in terms of their the real world benefits versus the projected or estimated benefits? Do you feel that there should be some kind of standardization that because different automakers can use different metrics to project their emission benefits? So do you feel that there should be some sort of standardization of metrics, which is just to better quantify the real world operational benefits?
Beyond the EPA labels that already exist.
Beyond the EPA labels, especially. Yeah.
And I was going to say, we've done a lot of work to change our methodology, update it to be more reflective of real world metrics. So, our fuel economy labels, we think we've done a fair amount of research to try to get them to communicate the information that consumers need. We have things in there that say, this vehicle will save you X amount of dollars over the life of the vehicle. So I think we've done a lot of work on that, but we need to do something.
I think I would agree completely that that's a very well-known metric and something that the industry is comfortable with. We've been using the test cycle and the evolution of our own label for decades. I think trying to get an industry as well as the public policy to regulators to agree on something new or different would be very challenging. And I don't know, at least I don't sense that there's a outcry to make a change, maybe to add more information. We're very proud of what we're on the label already, the window sticker.
Please join me in thanking our panelists today.